Dr. Vivienne Ashworth bought a forgotten pyramid for $5 at a government auction in Alexandria, where renowned archaeologists and billionaire collectors stood in absolute silence, watching her bid on what should have been the archaeological discovery of the century. But nobody else raised their hand, and when the auctioneer's gavel came down, every expert in that room looked at her not with jealousy or frustration, but with something that made her spine crawl. Pure terror, as if she'd just purchased her own death sentence instead of making the find that could rewrite ancient history. The morning sun blazed through the tall windows of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina's auction hall, casting long shadows across rows of folding chairs filled with the world's most distinguished archaeologists. Dr. Vivienne Ashworth sat near the back, clutching her worn leather portfolio containing her life's work and her last $3,200 in traveler's checks. At 34, Vivienne had already been blacklisted from 3 major universities for her controversial theories about pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization. Her published papers arguing for advanced technology in ancient Egypt had made her a pariah in academic circles, but she knew she was right. She just needed proof. The Egyptian Ministry of Heritage was liquidating minor archaeological assets to fund their restoration of major tourist sites. Most lots were going for astronomical sums to private collectors and museum consortiums, but Vivienne had her eye on Lot 73, Pyramid Khufu Neter, catalogued as a small, non-significant burial structure located in the remote Bahariya Depression, 60 miles southwest of the Great Pyramids. The auction catalog listed it with a starting bid of $5 American. Clearly a typo, but Vivienne had called the ministry twice to confirm. Both times the officials had hesitated before assuring her the price was correct, though their voices carried an odd reluctance. As the morning progressed, Vivienne recognized faces from archaeological conferences worldwide. Dr. Rashida Al-Mahmoud from the Supreme Council of Antiquities sat in the front row, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann from the German Archaeological Institute kept checking his phone nervously. Even Catalina Montenegro, the ruthless antiquities dealer who'd stolen funding from Vivienne's last dig, was present but unusually subdued. When Lot 72, a small collection of pottery shards, sold for $45,000, Vivienne felt her heart sink. She'd never be able to compete with these prices. But then the auctioneer called Lot 73, and something extraordinary happened. The room went dead silent. "Pyramid Khufu Neter," the auctioneer announced, his voice suddenly lacking its previous enthusiasm. "Located in the Bahariya Depression, site area approximately 2 acres. Starting bid, $5 American. Vivienne waited for the inevitable laughter, the correction, the explanation that this was obviously a mistake. Instead, she watched as every single person in the room suddenly found their auction paddles intensely interesting. Dr. Rashida Al-Mahmoud from the Supreme Council of Antiquities was actually shaking her head slowly, as if witnessing something tragic unfolding. A cold dread settled in Vivienne's stomach, but she raised her paddle anyway. $5. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. She could feel eyes boring into her from every direction, not the competitive glances she'd expected, but something far more unsettling. People were looking at her with pity, the kind of expression you'd see at a funeral when someone was about to make a terrible mistake. Professor Zimmermann suddenly stood and walked toward her. "Dr. Ashworth," he said in his thick German accent, "perhaps we should speak privately before—" "Going once," the auctioneer interrupted, looking around the room with obvious hope that someone else would bid. An elderly Egyptian man sitting 2 rows ahead turned to look at her directly. His eyes were filled with what he could only describe as sorrow. Next to him, a woman in expensive jewelry was whispering urgently in Arabic to her companion, pointing in her direction. "Going twice!" Catalina Montenegro, who had been ruthlessly outbidding everyone all morning, was staring at Vivienne with genuine horror. This was the same woman who'd once bid $200,000 on a single canopic jar, and now she wouldn't raise her paddle for a $5 pyramid? Dr. Al-Mahmoud suddenly rose from her seat. "Miss," she called out in accented English, "you should know that site has been classified as problematic." But before she could explain what problematic meant, the auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. "Sold to Dr. Ashworth for $5 American." The reaction was immediate and chilling. At least half the room began gathering their belongings and heading for the exits with obvious haste. But the other half, roughly 30 people, remained seated, all of them now watching Vivienne with expressions that ranged from sympathy to outright fear. As Vivienne made her way to the payment desk, trying to process what had just happened, she became aware of hushed conversations erupting around her. She caught fragments in multiple languages. Should have stopped her, like the others before. 3 months, maybe less. The ministry official who processed her payment was a nervous young man named Karim who couldn't maintain eye contact. His hands shook as he stamped her deed, and he kept glancing toward a group of older officials huddled near the back wall, all of whom were watching the transaction with grave expressions. "Dr. Ashworth?" Karim said quietly. "The deed comes with several advisories. Site access restrictions, safety protocols, and historical incident reports. You should review them carefully." "What kind of historical incidents?" Karim's eyes darted around nervously. "Previous excavation attempts. There have been complications. Perhaps you should speak with Farouk Hassan. He is the site supervisor." As Vivienne signed the final papers, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. The people who hadn't left after her purchase weren't conducting any other business. They were all still watching her, as if waiting to see what would happen next, as if they expected something specific to occur, something they'd seen before. That's when Catalina Montenegro approached her. The Spanish antiquities dealer was known throughout the archaeological world for her aggressive tactics and willingness to pay any price for valuable pieces. She had personally destroyed Vivienne's career by bribing officials to revoke her dig permits, claiming Vivienne's theories were dangerously unscientific. Now she stood before Vivienne with an expression of genuine concern. "Dr. Ashworth," Catalina said, her usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "I have a proposition. $50,000 for your purchase. Cash, right now." Vivienne stared at her. "You want to pay me $50,000 for something I just bought for $5? $100,000, Catalina said immediately. "Final offer." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about profit. This was about something else entirely. "What's really happening here?" Vivienne demanded. Catalina glanced around the room, then leaned closer. "That pyramid isn't forgotten, Dr. Ashworth. It's quarantined. The Egyptian government has been paying people to keep it sealed for decades, and there's a very good reason why." Before Vivienne could respond, Dr. Al-Mahmoud approached them both. The senior Egyptian archaeologist looked exhausted, as if she'd been through this conversation many times before. "Dr. Ashworth," she said wearily, "I assume Miss Montenegro has made you an offer." "She's trying to buy my pyramid for $100,000. "Make it $200,000, she said immediately. "From the ministry. Official purchase. We'll have the papers drawn up within the hour." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Two of the most powerful figures in Mediterranean archaeology were desperately trying to buy back a $5 pyramid that apparently no one wanted her to own. "What aren't you telling me?" Vivienne asked.
Dr. Al-Mahmoud and Catalina exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge, shared secrets, and shared fear. That the pyramid has been the site of 7 excavation attempts over the past 40 years. 4 teams simply abandoned their work and left Egypt permanently. Two teams never left the site at all. What do you mean, never left? I mean, they're still there, Dr. Ashworth. And the 7th team from Oxford University just 3 years ago came back changed, fundamentally changed. They speak in ancient languages they never studied. They know things about pre-dynastic Egypt that aren't in any historical record. And they all insist that the pyramid must never be opened. The revelation hit Vivienne like a physical blow. But instead of discouraging her, it filled her with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. This was exactly the kind of discovery that could vindicate her theories about advanced ancient technology. "Thank you for the warnings," she said, clutching her deed tighter. "But I think I'll take my chances." Both women stared at her in horror. "Dr. Ashworth," Catalina said urgently, "you don't understand. Those missing archaeologists, we know where they are. They're still at the pyramid, still digging, still working. But they don't eat, they don't sleep, and they don't respond to anyone who tries to contact them. They've been excavating the same chamber for 2 decades. Despite every warning, Vivienne rented a Land Rover and drove south from Alexandria toward the Bahariya Depression. The coordinates on her deed led her away from the main highway onto increasingly primitive roads that eventually became little more than tracks in the sand. The landscape grew more desolate with each mile. Even the Bedouin settlements disappeared, leaving nothing but endless expanses of barren desert under the merciless afternoon sun. According to her GPS, she was still 15 miles from her destination when she noticed the first anomaly. The desert sand here wasn't the usual golden color. It had a grayish tint, almost metallic, and it crunched under her tires with a sound like breaking glass. When she stopped to examine it more closely, she found that each grain seemed to have tiny crystalline structures, as if the sand had been partially melted and reformed. 10 miles from her destination, she crested a ridge and saw something that made her pull over immediately. In the distance, a small complex of modern buildings sat in the middle of the desert. Solar panels, satellite dishes, and radio antennas indicated a sophisticated communications setup. Someone had built a permanent monitoring station in one of the most remote locations in Egypt, and according to her map, it was positioned exactly between her current location and the pyramid. As she approached the compound, a figure emerged from the main building. He was tall and weathered, perhaps in his early 50s, wearing traditional Bedouin robes but modern boots. What struck her immediately was how he moved, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years in dangerous situations. "Dr. Ashworth," he called out in perfect English as she parked. "I am Farouk Hassan. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?"
Farouk's expression was grim but not unfriendly. "The ministry contacted us immediately after the auction. They wanted to ensure you understood what you've purchased, and they wanted to make sure we could document whatever happens next." As he led her toward the buildings, Vivienne noticed several disturbing details. The compound was clearly designed for long-term habitation, with living quarters, a laboratory, and what appeared to be a medical facility. But it was also fortified. Reinforced walls, security cameras, and communication equipment that looked military-grade. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. 37 years, Farouk replied. "I was part of the first monitoring team established after the 1987 incident. We've had a permanent presence here ever since." "What happened in 1987? Farouk stopped walking and turned to look at her directly. "Dr. Ashworth, before we go any further, I need to know, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?
Because once we walk over that ridge and you see the pyramid site, there will be no going back. You'll become part of this situation, whether you want to or not." The warning in his voice was unmistakable, but it only strengthened Vivienne's resolve. She'd spent her career being told her theories were impossible, that ancient civilizations couldn't have possessed advanced knowledge or technology. If this pyramid contained evidence that could prove her right, she was willing to face any danger. "Show me," she said. They climbed into Farouk's jeep and drove up a steep, rocky slope. As they reached the crest, Vivienne got her first clear view of Pyramid Khufu Necher, and she understood immediately why 7 archaeological teams had fled in terror. The pyramid wasn't small, as the auction catalog had claimed. It was massive, nearly as large as the Pyramid of Khafre, but almost completely buried under centuries of accumulated sand and debris. What was visible above ground showed construction techniques that defied everything she knew about ancient Egyptian architecture. The exposed stones weren't limestone or granite, but some kind of dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The blocks were fitted together with such precision that she couldn't see the joints even through binoculars. And the surface was covered with symbols that definitely weren't hieroglyphics. But what made her breath catch was the activity around the pyramid. At least a dozen people were working at various excavation sites around the structure. Even at this distance, she could see they were using modern equipment: generators, floodlights, computerized surveying instruments. But something was fundamentally wrong with the scene. The workers moved in perfect synchronization, as if choreographed. They never stopped to rest, never stopped to drink water or seek shade, never interacted with each other. They simply worked with mechanical precision, excavating the same areas over and over again. "The missing archaeological teams?" Vivienne asked quietly. Farouk nodded grimly. "Dr. Sarah Chen's team from 1987, Professor Victor Kozlov's group from 1994, the Brazilian expedition from 2001, Dr. James Morrison's Oxford team from 2021, and several individual researchers who came here over the years. They all arrived with normal academic goals. Now they're old guardians." "Guardians of what?" "Come," Farouk said, starting the jeep again. "You need to see the entrance chamber. But Dr. Ashworth, once you go inside, you'll understand why everyone who enters becomes compelled to stay." The sealed chamber. As they drove closer to the pyramid, Vivienne could see the excavation work in disturbing detail. The archaeological teams worked with tools that looked decades old but perfectly maintained. Their clothes were faded but intact, their equipment functional but showing no signs of recent maintenance. It was as if they'd been preserved in time, frozen at the moment of their discovery. None of them acknowledged the approaching jeep. They simply continued their work, measuring, cataloging, excavating, with the methodical precision of machines. "Do they ever stop?" Vivienne asked. "Never," Farouk replied. "They work through sandstorms, through the blazing heat of day and the cold of night. The only time they pause is when someone new arrives. Then they all stop and watch, until the newcomer either leaves or—" He didn't finish the sentence. They parked near a modern-looking structure that had been built directly adjacent to the pyramid's main entrance. Inside, Vivienne found a sophisticated monitoring station, with cameras focused on various parts of the excavation site, seismic equipment measuring underground activity, and communication devices that Farouk explained were used to report daily to government officials in Cairo. "Every government that's ever controlled this region has maintained some form of watch over this site. The Romans had a garrison here, the Ottomans built a fort, the British established a research station, and now we have this. What are they all so afraid of? Farouk led her to a reinforced door marked with warnings in Arabic, English, French, and what appeared to be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. This leads to the entrance chamber. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? Vivienne's hands were shaking with excitement rather than fear. Open it. The door led to a modern concrete passage that connected with the pyramid's original entrance. The walls were lined with monitoring equipment and LED lighting, but as they descended, the modern installations gave way to ancient stonework that took Vivienne's breath away. The passages were carved from single pieces of the same dark stone she'd seen on the exterior, but here she could see incredible detail in the construction. The walls weren't simply smooth. They were covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in her peripheral vision. Mathematical spirals and geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. "The symbols," she whispered. "They're not Egyptian, are they?" "No," Farouk confirmed. "We've had linguists and archaeologists from every major university examine them. The consensus is that they predate known Egyptian writing by thousands of years. But that's not the strangest part." He stopped at a junction where the passage split in 3 directions. Each path was marked with modern signs in multiple languages, but Vivienne's attention was drawn to something else entirely. Fresh footprints in the ancient dust. Dozens of them, all leading deeper into the pyramid. "The archaeological teams," Farouk explained. "They come down here every day, sometimes multiple times. They're excavating something in the central chamber, but they won't explain what they're looking for. When we try to ask, they respond in languages that don't exist in any historical record." As they continued down the main passage, Vivienne became aware of a sound that made her skin crawl. Voices echoing from deep within the pyramid, speaking in harmonious unison. The language was unlike anything she'd ever heard. Not Arabic, not ancient Egyptian, but something that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to some primitive part of her brain. "What are they saying?" Farouk's expression darkened. "According to our linguists, it roughly translates to 'the sleeper stirs' and 'the stars align again.' They've been chanting the same phrases for decades." The main passage opened into a circular chamber that defied every principle of Egyptian tomb construction. Instead of rectangular rooms and narrow corridors typical of Egyptian pyramid architecture, this space was perfectly spherical, with the walls, floors, and ceiling all curving into continuous surface covered with the same shifting patterns. At the center of the chamber stood a massive sarcophagus, but unlike any Vivienne had ever seen. It wasn't carved from stone. It appeared to be forged from some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light, creating shadows that moved independently of their lighting equipment. But it was what surrounded the sarcophagus that made Vivienne understand why archaeological teams had been driven mad with terror. 12 figures in modern excavation gear stood in perfect formation around the metal coffin. Their clothes identified them as members of different expeditions spanning 4 decades. But they all stood motionless, facing the sarcophagus, their hands positioned as if performing some kind of ritual. Their eyes were completely white, rolled back in their heads, and their mouths moved in silent synchronization with the chanting voices echoing from deeper in the pyramid. "Dr. Chen's team?" whispered Vivienne. Farouk nodded toward specific figures. "Dr. Sarah Chen, the team leader from 1987. Professor Kozlov from the Russian expedition. Dr. Morrison from Oxford. They're all here, all preserved, all guarding whatever's in that sarcophagus." As Vivienne approached the standing figures, she noticed they showed no signs of aging or decay. Their skin was pale but healthy, their clothes faded but intact. It was as if they'd been suspended in time at the moment of their discovery. On the sarcophagus itself, someone had carved fresh inscriptions in modern English. "We found what the Pharaohs feared. Now we guard what must never wake. Others will come, and they will join us, until there are enough of us to hold it in eternal sleep. The work continues. The work must continue. The stars are almost right again." As she read, Vivienne became aware that all 12 figures had turned to look at her. Their white, sightless eyes tracked her movement, and their silent mouths began forming words she could almost understand. Behind her, Farouk whispered urgently, "Dr. Ashworth, we should leave immediately. The sun is setting, and they become active after dark." But as they turned to go, Vivienne heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of metal grinding against metal, deep and resonant, like some massive mechanism awakening after eons of silence. The sarcophagus was opening. Ancient seals that had held for millennia were finally breaking, and whatever the pharaohs had imprisoned with star knowledge and bound with the lives of willing guardians was stirring in its sleep. Light began to emanate from within the opening sarcophagus. Not normal light, but something that cast shadows upward and made the geometric patterns on the walls writhe like living things. The 12 guardians raised their hands in unison, and for the first time in decades, they spoke aloud in perfect English. "Welcome, Dr. Ashworth. We have been waiting for you. The final phase can now begin." The light emanating from the sarcophagus wasn't like anything in nature. It pulsed with colors that had no names, casting shadows that moved independently and seemed to reach toward Vivienne with hungry tendrils. The 12 guardians stood perfectly still, their white eyes now glowing with the same impossible radiance. "Dr. Ashworth," Farouk whispered, urgently, backing toward the passage, "we need to evacuate the entire region, now." But Vivienne found herself transfixed by what she was seeing inside the opening sarcophagus. It wasn't a mummy or human remains, it was something that her mind struggled to comprehend. A form that seemed to shift between dimensions, sometimes appearing as a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, other times as a geometric pattern that extended beyond the physical space of the chamber. The guardians spoke in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Behold, Nith Cthul, the Star Dreamer, the entity that fell from the void between worlds when the pharaohs were young. The pharaohs used forbidden knowledge to bind it in eternal sleep, but the stars have aligned again. The final seal requires a willing soul of sufficient knowledge." "Sufficient knowledge of what?" Vivienne asked, surprising herself by responding directly to the guardians. "Archaeological expertise, understanding of ancient construction, ability to read the star maps carved in the walls, knowledge of the binding rituals. You possess what we need to complete the prison that will hold it for another cosmic cycle." Farouk grabbed her arm. "Dr. Ashworth, don't listen to them. Every person who's entered this chamber has been convinced they were chosen for some noble purpose. They all believed they were saving the world by staying here." But as the entity in the sarcophagus continued to stir, Vivienne began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The geometric patterns covering the walls weren't decorations. They were a three-dimensional map of stellar positions, showing the alignment of stars and planets across thousands of years. The pharaohs hadn't just built a tomb, they'd constructed a cosmic prison designed to function only when specific celestial conditions were met. "The star knowledge," Vivienne whispered, pieces falling into place. The ancient Egyptians didn't develop pyramid construction on their own. They were taught by something else, something that needed to be contained. The guardians nodded in unison. The entity shared its knowledge to ensure its own imprisonment. It taught the pharaohs to build these chambers, knowing that one day it would need willing guardians to maintain the seal when the original binding weakened. Through the monitoring equipment Farouk wore, they could hear frantic radio chatter from the surface. Government officials in Cairo, military commanders, even international agencies all responding to seismic readings that suggested something massive was stirring beneath the Egyptian desert. "How long do we have?" Vivienne asked. "The full awakening will take 72 hours. Unless the final seal is completed by a willing guardian of sufficient knowledge, the entity will break free and begin converting this reality to match its own dimensional requirements. What you call reality will cease to exist." Farouk's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Base station, this is Cairo Command. Satellite imagery shows energy signatures unlike anything we've recorded. Military assets are being deployed to establish a perimeter, but we need to know, can the situation be contained?" Farouk looked at Vivienne with desperate eyes. "Dr. Ashworth, you have a choice. We can evacuate right now. The government has contingency plans. They'll seal this entire region with concrete and steel, then monitor it for the next century. It won't stop the entity permanently, but it might delay the awakening." "Or?" Vivienne asked, though she already knew the answer. "Or you join the Guardians, become part of the living seal that keeps it contained. Your archaeological knowledge, combined with their existing binding, could create a prison strong enough to hold it for another millennia." The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the stones of the pyramid itself. Everything she'd worked for, every theory she'd developed about ancient civilizations had led to this moment. She'd been right about advanced technology in ancient Egypt, but the truth was far more terrifying than she had imagined. As if summoned by the crisis, new voices echoed through the monitoring system. Heavy footsteps approached through the pyramid's passages, and within minutes a team of armed figures in hazmat suits entered the chamber. At their head was a woman Vivienne recognized from archaeological conferences, Dr. Elena Vasquez, supposedly a researcher with UNESCO, but now clearly something much more significant. "Dr. Ashworth," Elena said through her suit's communication system, "I'm Agent Vasquez with the International Anomalous Containment Protocol. We've been monitoring this situation for decades." "The government knows about this?" "Governments, plural. This entity isn't unique. There are 17 similar sites worldwide, all dating to approximately the same period. Ancient civilizations were given star knowledge to build prisons for entities that fell from space during a cosmic alignment that occurs every 26,000 years. Elena gestured toward the still-stirring sarcophagus. "The Maya built containment pyramids in Guatemala, the Egyptians built these structures, the Mesopotamians constructed ziggurat prisons, even Stonehenge is actually a containment array, all designed to hold these entities until the next cosmic cycle."
"But the seals are weakening," Farouk added, his voice grim. "This is the third site to show signs of failure in the past decade. If even one entity breaks free completely, it will signal the others, a cascading awakening that would end human civilization." The revelation hit Vivienne like a physical blow. Her entire academic career, her theories about ancient advanced technology, the mysterious construction techniques that had puzzled archaeologists for centuries, it had all been about containing cosmic horrors that most of humanity never knew existed. "How many people know the truth?" she asked. "Perhaps 1,000 individuals worldwide," Elena replied. "Archaeologists, government officials, military commanders, researchers like yourself who stumbled too close to the truth. We call ourselves the Eternal Watch. Our job is to monitor these sites, maintain the cover stories, and recruit new guardians when the old ones retire." "Retire?"
At the monitoring station in the Bahariya Depression, a new supervisor took over from Farooq Hassan, who had officially retired after 4 decades of service. The new guardian stood watch over the pyramid, maintaining the equipment and filing daily reports that everything remained stable. Inside the pyramid, 13 figures now stood around the sealed sarcophagus, their combined will holding one of the most dangerous entities in the cosmos in eternal sleep. Dr. Vivienne Ashworth had found the archaeological discovery of a lifetime and had become part of it forever. Late at night, when the monitoring equipment registered the faintest seismic tremors from deep beneath the pyramid, the guardians would speak in unison. "We are the watch. We are the binding. We guard what must never wake. The stars wheel overhead, but the prison holds." And in the deepest chamber of the pyramid, the entity that had once taught star knowledge to ancient pharaohs settled back into dreams of impossible geometries and distant worlds, held in place by the willing sacrifice of those who understood that some discoveries are too dangerous for humanity to possess. Dr. Vivienne Ashworth had bought a pyramid for $5 and discovered the truth about ancient civilizations. The price of that knowledge was her humanity, but the value of her sacrifice was the continued existence of reality itself. The watch continues. The stars wheel overhead, and somewhere in the Egyptian desert, 13 guardians maintain their eternal vigil, protecting a world that will never know how close it came to ending.